It is May Day around the globe, but are workers' rights being eroded in the United States? Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. From the Philippines to Brazil, International Workers' Day, a celebration of the rights of workers, was marked with rallies this May 1st in many parts of the world. In France, it turned into a protest against a government proposal to increase the retirement age. Workers' Day was born out of violent clashes between police and protesters in Chicago back in 1886, an event which became a symbol of the struggle for workers' rights. But May Day is not recognized in the United States, which holds its own Labor Day in September. We begin with this report from Benji Haya.
While much of the rest of the world embraces a Labor Day, in the US, this Monday is like any other. America's workers, employers and political leaders have had a checkered history on labour issues, with public sympathy for the rights of workers often divided along party lines. Unionisation in the US was at its peak in the 1950s, yet data from the Bureau of Labour Statistics shows union membership has since fallen to its lowest share on record. Only 1 in 10 American workers is now in a union. The decline in union membership rates contradicts a recent trend. Unions are enjoying their highest approval ratings in the US in decades, and a president who's proclaimed himself as leading the most pro-union administration in American history. Still, the number of non-union jobs outpaced the growth of union membership last year. That's largely because the most traditionally unionised sectors, industries like manufacturing, transportation, construction, represent an ever-shrinking share of the workforce. And various changes by lawmakers have also made it harder for unions to grow. Dozens of states have approved right-to-work laws, giving them the authority to determine whether workers can be required to join a labour union in order to keep their job. Some politicians are pushing back in a bid to expand workers' rights. Senators Bernie Sanders and fellow progressive Democrat Elizabeth Warren are trying to advance a bill to tax companies extra if found guilty of pay disparity. CEOs at the largest publicly traded firms are typically paid hundreds of times more than their median employees. Many citizens, though, aren't waiting for legislation. They're taking action into their own hands. Around the country last year, staff at hundreds of Starbucks stores voted to unionise, and thousands of gig economy workers launched a series of high-profile unionisation drives. Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, to name a few. Momentum is reaching mainstream audiences. Comedian John Oliver, in a segment last month, exposed how so-called essential workers on farms are not treated as their title might suggest. Then, just days ago, a judge ordered Tesla to stop violating employee rights after supervisors were found to have breached labour laws by telling them not to discuss salaries and conditions. It may not be Workers' Day stateside on May 1st, that comes in 4 months, but workers here are still charged up. Benji Haya, CGTN, Washington, D.C.
There's a lot to discuss. Let's bring in our panelists. Joseph Williams is a former senior editor for US News and World Report. He joins us right here in Washington, D.C. Also here in D.C., Brian Becker is the executive director of the Answer Coalition. From New York, Anthony Chan is the former chief economist at JPMorgan Chase, and Ryan Patel is a global business executive. He joins us from Los Angeles. Welcome to all of you. Brian Becker, Monday, as I said, is May Day, Workers' Day, as it's known in some parts of the world, but not here in the United States. There is Labor Day, of course, in September, at the end of summer. But we don't see the kinds of parades and commemorations that we see in other countries honoring workers. And as we just heard our reporter tell us, union membership is now at its lowest level since the 1950s. Why is that?
Couple important points there. May Day was born in the United States, in Chicago, when the leaders of the movement for the 8-hour day were put on trial, and 4 of them were executed after violent protests in 1886. Later, the Socialist International proclaimed that in solidarity with those fighting for a shorter work week. At that time, the work day was about 16 hours. They proclaimed it International Workers' Day. But after World War II, when the witch hunt was on, when the Cold War was on, and the anti-communist hysteria reached a fever pitch in the United States, if you celebrated workers' rights, you were automatically considered to be a communist. And if you were a communist, you were an ally of the Soviet Union and thus considered to be a fifth column. So May Day, in the tradition of this militant labor movement, was driven out of the memory of the U.S. labor movement and out of U.S. society. Here we have a situation where 10%, less than 10%, it's really about 8% of the labor force is now in unions compared to 1946, when this hysteria began, when the number of unionized workers was about 35%. And as a consequence, wages are going down, benefits are going down. You have today on May Day in Virginia, 400,000 workers are going to lose health care access because they're going to be driven off of Medicaid, and 140,000 of those will be their children. And CEO pay is now 399 times greater than that of the average factory worker. So every $1,000 a worker makes, the CEO is making $399,000. So we see these class divergences happening as the labor movement has become increasingly weakened in the United States. But as your report said, people are taking matters into their own hands in spite of very vicious anti-labor laws and anti-union busting campaigns by bosses, by employers. Workers are starting to organize again, especially young workers.
But given those differences that you're talking about there, Brian, are you surprised that we haven't actually seen more militancy in the labor movement?
Well, in a way, yes. But when you look at the past few years, you had teacher strikes in the so-called red states, female-led labor movement starting to come back to life, surprising many people. Now you have people working in coffee shops starting to organize. I think the big problem, and I have been in the labor movement myself organizing, the big problem is the National Labor Relations Board is tilted, it's skewed, it makes it very hard to organize a union. Most workers want to be in a union, but you have to face bosses' intimidation, the fear of losing your job, the fear that the plant will, or the factory or the office will just go somewhere else if you unionize. That's why it's mainly public sector workers. There's a lot of obstacles thrown in the ways of working people when they want to form unions in the United States. We say it's a free country, but look, Joe Biden, he says he's the greatest pro-labor president. He just banned the railroad workers from striking. Again, the deck is stacked in the United States against workers.
Joseph Williams, as we see the rest of the world commemorate Labor Day, here in the United States, we're seeing large-scale layoffs, especially in the tech sector. And, as Brian pointed out a moment ago, it's very difficult for workers to now join unions. I mean, many states have these right-to-work laws, which makes it very difficult for to basically force a worker to join a union. How would you assess the labor movement in the U.S. today?
It seems in recent months that we've seen green shoots, to borrow a phrase from long ago, in the labor movement. Starbucks, other hourly wage places like Amazon had a very big union drive. They have begun to resurrect the labor union movement in the United States. However, it's a long, long way to go, not the least of which are because of the right to work laws in certain states that you mentioned. Most of them seem to be Republican states where right to laws are passed, or right to work laws, beg your pardon, are passed, but also because of a couple of Supreme Court decisions that are notable. One was a Fredericks decision in California. That would have been somewhere around 2001, 2020, 2019, which basically the Supreme Court ruled that a union can't force members to give money to fund the union. However, if the union bargains and negotiates for wage increases, the employee who refused to give money to the union is automatically included on those wage increases. And there was another similar case that happened not too many years after that, where a home health aide in Illinois sued and got to the Supreme Court because he didn't want to pay union fees either. And so both of those cases ended up in very strong victories for management over labor, and that's made it extremely difficult for unions to get funding. It's made it really hard for them to mount campaigns. Now, unions at Starbucks and at Amazon, they've had the youthful enthusiasm, and they've overcome long odds. But in the very same year, or the very consecutive year, after Amazon voted to give a union to workers in New York or New Jersey, I believe it was, they very much quashed union efforts elsewhere. So it's not a done deal, even though we've seen signs of life in the labor movement. They've got a long, long way to go, and many mountains to climb before they get anywhere close to where they were in the 50s, 60s, and even as recently as the 80s and the 90s.
Ryan Patel, I want to put up a graph which shows the evolution of CEO to workers' compensation rates. I mean, we have been talking about this, but we have this more graphic representation here. In the 60s, as you can see, a CEO would make 20 times what the median wage was at a company. Now he or she makes 400, or as Brian pointed out, 399 times what a worker makes. That's the average, of course, and in some instances it could be 1,000 times. I mean, is this kind of inequality in the workplace sustainable?
Well, I mean, I think we break it down to the different service sectors. I mean, it's not, when you think of how the market reacts to, I mean, let's call what that is. It's a lot of stock options that CEOs are negotiating, right? The board is giving up these options to get their leader, and a lot of these incentives is tied to some of the successes, the unicorns to that degree, so they could take technically a smaller base compared to their peers and end up to that 400 to 1x times. And I think part of what we're seeing in when CEOs are negotiating compensations, they're looking for that higher risk, higher reward, but the boards are giving it to them because they don't have to feel like they're paying it right now, but down the road. And I think the longer and the larger the inequality we see of this, we also start to see how do you have to give a message and be able to use that compensation back when things are not going well. Are you taking a decrease in salary to help your employees out? Are you holding on to that, millions and millions of dollars in salary? I think that is what we've seen over the last few years and to see which CEOs are course correcting their salary when the business doesn't match with their compensation.
Anthony Chen, how do you see the labor environment? As our reporter pointed out in his report, we saw the highest rates of unionization, mainly in the manufacturing sectors. That's back in the 50s and the 60s. Now that's changed. The United States is not a major manufacturer. A lot of that has been offshored. Is that possibly one of the reasons why we see such low levels of unionization?
That certainly is one of those reasons, but there are many others. For example, something that hasn't been mentioned yet is the effects of globalization. With globalization, there's greater competition. And so workers, if they really ask for too much or they ask for more, there is always the risk that their jobs can go overseas. You point out the manufacturing sector, as that has shrunken, that has also hurt unionization. But now we have a different trend, and that is reshoring, or in some cases, friendshoring. And so if you now have jobs coming back to the United States in the manufacturing sector, then that will stimulate to some extent unionization. In fact, last year, we had an increase of 200,000 people joining unions last year. And as others have mentioned, we've seen a great impetus for companies to become unionized, whether it's a Starbucks, whether it's Amazon. We are moving in that direction. And one of the reasons for that is that we are seeing shortages of labor. In March of 2022, you had 2 job openings for every person that was unemployed. That's come down a little bit as the economy may be slowing to maybe, it is now at 1.7, and that will continue to slow as the economy to some extent slows down even further. But when you have this massive shortage of workers, that will empower workers to some extent. But at the same time, you can't completely reverse the trends that we've seen since the 1960s, where unionization was much higher and now it's much lower. So we're going to see an increase in unionization, but it's a slow pace, and it will take a long time to increase that number. And it's unlikely that it's going to go back to the levels that we saw in the 1950s.
So, Anthony, you point to worker shortages as well as globalization, but to what extent is the constant pressure from Wall Street on big corporations and companies, the constant pressure on share price, responsible for workers losing their jobs in many instances and for keeping wages low?
Well, we know that the pressure from Wall Street is real, and it not only puts pressure on salaries, but it also puts pressure on companies to keep their costs down, to improve their profit margins. We know that every quarter, investors are not only looking at profits, they're looking at profit margins, they're looking at the growth rates. So the pressure is there, and that is not a helpful situation for these unionization movement. I'm not making a judgment call as to whether it's a good or bad thing, but it's a reality. And if you want to look for some of the things that are causing the lack of unionization to grow, certainly those pressures are culprits, no doubt.
Ryan, what do you make of those factors that Anthony just brought up? Globalization, worker shortages, and of course, the pressure to not just keep wages low, but keep costs low in general.
Yeah, I mean, it's the sort of the essence of this stage of capitalism, especially with globalization, where basically employers can put a gun to the head of workers and say, look, take a wage cut, or else we're going to go to Mexico, or we'll go to Taiwan, we'll go somewhere where we can pay workers at a lower wage. And the reality is, when workers do organize, frequently employers do leave. It's this kind of unfettered, undiluted economic power over society. It's very similar. It feels to me like the way the monarchies were in late stage Europe in the Middle Ages, when things just had to change. When you have a situation where CEO pay has not, in ratio to worker pay, hasn't gone up double or triple since 1979. The numbers used by Fortune magazine is it's gone up 1,322%. If the average CEO is making $27.8 million a year, that's just the average, that means they're making $500,000 a week. If it's a 5-day work week, that's $100,000 a day.
Yeah.
That if they work a 10-hour day, that's $10,000 an hour. When you have this kind of obscenity of accumulation of wealth, why the people who do the work and without whom no profits are made. Look, if the CEO, if say Jeff Bezos goes into a coma, God forbid, today and doesn't come out until next week, nobody will notice. But if the Amazon workers don't come to work during the next week, all of the profits from Amazon will go away. Jeff Bezos doesn't really make the profits, the workers do. But the way American labor markets are structured, all of the benefits go to the very, very top.
Joseph Williams, we had a short quote there from Bernie Sanders in our report, the US Senator. He talked about one company, Starbucks, one of the best-known companies in the United States and, of course, around the world, and its efforts to block unionization. Let's listen to what Sanders had to say.
Over the past 18 months, Starbucks has waged the most aggressive and illegal union-busting campaign in the modern history of our country. These violations include the illegal firing of more than a dozen Starbucks workers for the crime of exercising their right to form a union and to collectively bargain for better wages, benefits, and working conditions.
So, Joseph, what's behind this? This is a very vigorous effort by Starbucks to block unionization. They've been using some very tough tactics. What's behind it?
Well, I mean, you alluded to it before. Share price, margin of profit to loss, any one of a number of things, because the more workers are unionized, the greater bargaining power they have at the table, the more they can demand improved working conditions. And let's be honest, a job at Starbucks is pretty much thankless, and it's one of the jobs that might be considered a disposable job. Certainly the company doesn't consider it extremely valuable, at least not as valuable as Howard Schultz's job, in which he gets paid, several hundred times more than his workers, even though the worker is essential to Starbucks' success. So it's basically they're viewing these jobs as kind of disposable. They're viewing union efforts as an affront and something that could harm their bottom line, which would affect shareholders, because if unions are formed, they can bargain not only for better wages and working conditions, but to try to get people additional perks that would cost the company more money. So it seems fairly obvious what they're trying to do here. But what's interesting is the fact that unions have been able to succeed despite these tactics. Now it's going to get even harder now that there's more attention paid on what Starbucks is doing, as well as Starbucks is paying more attention to what union organizing campaigns are doing. So it's going to get more difficult, one would presume, over time. But certainly the fact that they've succeeded despite Starbucks' efforts to try to make working conditions difficult to organize, I think is fairly impressive and a positive sign for union growth in the United States.
Anthony Chan, is the cost of labor in the United States very much higher than, relatively speaking, that is, compared to other parts of the world? Because if we look at the benefits that are paid to workers here in the United States, a large part of that burden actually falls on the company, not on the federal government. I mean, there is no, for instance, public healthcare system for workers, or there is no sustainable retirement system. So does it make it very expensive here, and therefore companies are then driven to go to other countries?
There is no question that the cost of labor in the United States is more expensive. We can make the argument that workers deserve more, but it is more expensive. If it wasn't, you wouldn't have globalization. When you look at manufacturing costs per hour, they're more than twice as high in the United States compared to China. You go to Vietnam, and the numbers even increase even more. So clearly the cost of labor in the United States is much higher than in many other countries. And as I said earlier, if it wasn't the case, then all the products would be done in or produced in the United States, and we wouldn't take it overseas. But even with all that, these shortages of workers in the manufacturing sector, we have almost 700,000 manufacturing jobs that we can't fill. So we are seeing some pressure, and that is ultimately going to help labor. The question is it going to help them enough? Probably not, but it is an incremental benefit to workers to be in short supply relative to the demand.
Ryan Patel, we do see a level of hostility against workers. Maybe hostility is too harsh a word, but we see that from managements towards workers. The Economic Policy Institute says employers spend more than $430 million a year on what are called union avoidance consultants. I mean, these consultants work to show companies how to block unionization, or if they fail at that, then how to make sure that workers do not vote to join unions.
Yeah, I know that's an interesting stat. And, when I think about the future trends, I do believe that the employee has a lot more power than the employer has ever had in the history of, especially in the U.S., of voicing their opinion. Now, how they go about that and how they communicate that, what you said on, and is it through unions? Is it other ways the employer has to pay attention to? So when they're spending this type of money, maybe to blocking unions, the employees have to be addressed. If it's from the way that they work, the way that they get paid, it's not about money as well. It's about the working conditions, about the flexibility. These types of conversations have popped up more recently over the last few years. So for me to watch over the next couple of years, employees are going to start getting more educated, because some younger workers into this workforce has never really been a part of unions or don't know what that is. So I think there's another educational process going on at the same time when we get a new wave of workers to go, what is the best way to get what employees want? And this dialogue is not something that the employer can run away. No matter how much they pay consultants, they're going to have to address this one way or another. If it's personal development, is it about, reskilling, because that's another conversation. So the conversation has evolved from 20 years ago to now, what the employee wants, what they want to now, and I think it is very complicated. It'll be very interesting to see how companies address this, because they cannot ignore this anymore on it, because if you don't get treated right, you get to see it on the news, you get to see it on social media. It does affect your business, your services, your products. So, I think there's a lot more more outlets for people to share their stories, and it'll be interesting to see how they're going to be shared moving forward.
Joseph Williams, we've heard President Biden call himself the most pro-union president that the country has had, and I'm wondering is there a role for government here when it comes to workers' rights, or I mean, we've got unemployment now at 3.5%. I mean, is there just no incentive on the part of government, whether it be federal or local, to do something about this?
Well, there should be, because for the United States government, well, first of all, yes, there is a role for the federal government. We've got the National Labor Relations Board that mediates in disputes. We've got lawmakers that can pass right to work or free labor states, for lack of a better way to put it. But certainly government can do this, and they can encourage labor development. They've done it in the past. One of the problems that we're facing here is the fact that we are operating on very much a corporate system in politics as well as in the marketplace. I mean, we are looking at senators and representatives who are responsive to campaign contributions, and a lot of those campaign contributions come from major corporations. I mean, Bernie Sanders is probably a lone exception there, in that he probably is very much anti-receiving corporate contributions, but very much that kind of access that corporations pay for tends to tamp down any kind of legislative enthusiasm for helping unions to grow and foster a workplace. I mean, we could even go back and discuss about how Obamacare and how government-sponsored healthcare could be a factor in either enhancing or helping the unionization of workplaces kind of ease a little bit, because one of the big reasons why people stay in jobs that they really don't want is because of healthcare. Healthcare, if it was portable, we'd have more entrepreneurship, we'd have greater flexibility in the workplace, and there would be one less demand that unionization could make on employers. But there seems to be very little appetite to go there in this Congress, much less future Congresses. And at the state level, there's a whole lot of hostility towards labor unions in states that are dominated by Republicans than there are in states dominated by Democrats.
Brian, if there's one thing we saw about the value of workers, that was during the pandemic, because we saw then the workers that are really important to the economy, and those were people like emergency workers, healthcare workers, delivery workers, people who kept the stores open, kept shops open, farmers were very important. I mean, why didn't that translate into more recognition for the kinds of work that people like them do?
Indeed, it's sort of gross and disgusting, where in the middle of COVID we said these are the workers we rely on. We depend on them completely. Without them we don't live. And as soon as the crisis mode ends, they're completely expendable. And we call these workers heroes in the middle of COVID. And right now they can't feed their families. And in Virginia, 400,000 people are going to lose Medicaid, and 140,000 will be children. Those were those workers who qualified for Medicaid, but no longer do because the crisis has ended.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.